The card talks about the 20-mile march, obviously, but the concept behind it is actually quite interesting. And the concept, as you mentioned, Milan, is all about disciplined action. Concept talks about how you should commit to doing something and doing it consistently again and again and again and again. If you want to walk 20 miles, then you walk 20 miles. You don't walk 5 miles or 0 miles because the weather's bad. And you also don't walk 40 or 50 miles because that's taking it over the upper bound. It's about consistency of action, and it's about discipline of action so that you set your target and then you execute on it day by day, week by week, month by month to give you those consistent results. But Milan, the question from me, why did you create this as a card? What was the trigger for you to actually capture this as a concept?
A couple of things happened. When I realized, and the card is talking about it, I've been actually using similar principle, like telling people just do one a day, right? Or find the 15 minutes here, but be consistent, because your financial advisor will tell you that consistency is a key because of the compounding effects. And the same thing works in execution. What is the one thing we can do this week? So then what is the one thing that we can do next week? Very similar concept of really disciplined action that is leading you to consistent and predictable results, and also predictable effort.
Hello, Milan. How are you today?
I'm great. Yourself?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to going through our next card. So we drew a card at random, and what we pulled out was the 20-Mile March by Jim Collins.
Yeah, it's a great one, actually. I came across it several times, and most recently I reread Great by Choice, where the whole idea is introduced, and then we both saw Jim either in person or on webinars, and he's speaking about this a lot as
Yeah.
the relentless execution, or as he called it, disciplined action to get things done. So that's where this card came from, and I've used that principle so many times since.
Great by Choice, Jim Collins, awesome book. Not as well known as Good to Great, but there's some incredible concepts in here, and no doubt some of those concepts will end up as other cards as you come up with them. The card talks about the 20-mile march, obviously, but the concept behind it is actually quite interesting. The concept, as you mentioned, Milan, is all about disciplined action, and the concept talks about how you should commit to doing something and doing it consistently again and again and again and again. So if you want to walk 20 miles, then you walk 20 miles. You don't walk 5 miles or 0 miles because the weather's bad. And you also don't walk 40 or 50 miles because that's taking it over the upper bound. So Jim's message here is about consistency of action. And it's about discipline of action so that you set your target and then you execute on it day by day, week by week, month by month to give you those consistent results. But Milan, the question from me, why did you create this as a card? What was the trigger for you to actually capture this as a concept?
A couple of things happened, and obviously, I saw Jim speaking about it, and it was one of the big takeaways from his growth faculty presentation. But then I realized, and the card is talking about it, I've been actually using similar principle, like telling people, just do one a day, right? Or, find the 15 minutes here, but be consistent, because your financial advisor will tell you that consistency is a key because of the compounding effects. And the same thing works in execution. The same thing works like if you read Disciplines of Execution,
Yeah.
it's talking about a similar thing, right? What is the one thing we can do this week? So then what is the one thing that we can do next week? Very similar concept of really disciplined action that is leading you to consistent and predictable results, and also predictable effort. Jim is talking about the importance on sticking to the 20-mile march in good days and bad, as you were talking about it, because both is that you still need a result on the bad day, but then you don't want to overextend yourself or go beyond of what you were planning on the good day, because that might actually leave you in a more vulnerable position going after. And he's using the trip to, or the expedition to the South Pole as an example, but this happens in so many different places. For crying out loud, these cards themselves are my own 20-mile march, right? I'm
Yeah.
committing to publishing 2 a week, right? And it's been going as a clockwork, so hopefully,
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
stick
No.
with that.
Yeah. So the example that Jim Collins gave around the expedition to the North Pole, he contrasts the approach by the two teams. How would you summarize the different approaches of those two teams in that expedition to the North Pole?
Well, there were a lot of things. First of all, it was a South Pole, but even though it was supposed to be a North Pole, but then it ended up being a South Pole.
The other pole, the other pole. Yeah.
Yeah. We have two of them. But really, the idea was, we built our plan around making a predictable progress, and then we execute on it in a predictable and consistent way. Because when you think about it in that context, like, how do you space your storage depot? How much time do you plan you're going to use? How many supplies once you create this predictable plan and then stick to it, things fit into each other. You will leave yourself less exposed to bad luck or anything else that can happen, right? What the opponent did was exactly the opposite. They stay in the tent in the bad weather for several days
Mm.
and complain about the bad luck, and then they would exert themselves on the good ones. But there was no rhyme and reason to it. Only push forward as the weather weather allowed. And that's the same principle, everywhere else. Like if you want to write a book, the most important
Yeah.
ingredient is the butt glue, right? You need to sit down and write. You have to create that environment and that accountability mechanism yourself. Otherwise, it's never gonna happen.
Yeah. And he used the example of, as you alluded to, one of the teams, I think, Scott was, when the weather was bad, they just didn't move anywhere. They just stayed in the tents. Whereas Admonson, he, every single day, they covered off the distance, regardless of whether it was good weather, bad weather, raining, snowing, or sunny. Every single day they covered the distance. And in Great by Choice, Jim Collins uses another example of Southwest Airlines. When they were expanding, when they were first starting, they didn't actually leave Texas for years. They made sure that they had solidified the base, and gradually they expanded. Even though there were many towns that were clamoring for Southwest to fly to their towns, their cities in other states, they held back, and I think it was only after about 8 years that they actually scheduled their first flights outside of Texas. First of all, they went to New Orleans, and then they started going further afield. But the thing that I actually hadn't picked up at the first writing is, if your march is 20 miles, then that's your lower bound, but there has to be an upper bound as well. So it's not just about doing the minimum, it's about not doing more than the maximum. Because if you do more than the maximum, you may overexert yourself, you may overstretch yourself, and the history is littered with the corpses of companies that tried to grow too fast, overexerted themselves, ran too thin, and eventually expired. So the lesson is not about the minimum; it's also about the maximum. The upper bound is important too.
Yeah, the discipline works both ways, right?
Yeah.
Pushing you forward when you don't want to, and holding you back when you feel like you should go faster. Because there is a plan and there is a reason why that limit exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Do you
almost go ahead.
do you have any examples of companies that have maybe suffered because they didn't follow the concept of the 20-mile march?
Uh, you put me on the spot. Nothing comes to mind immediately, but when you look at the comparison companies in the
Mm.
Great by Choice, there are many examples there. I just can't pull one of them. But again, the typical mistake would be moving too much, exerting yourself too much without sufficient reserves because you didn't plan for a push like that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that we can come up with a whole bunch of examples. Anything comes to your mind?
Yeah. So there was an example that I was thinking of when I put the question, and sorry for putting you on the spot, but the example I was thinking of was there was a very, very well-known donut company that first opened. I think it was this is an Australian example. Then they first
Okay.
opened in Melbourne, and then they went to Sydney, and then it appeared that they seemed to be opening a new shop in a new suburb or a new town, pretty much every week, and the donuts were amazing. I mean, I haven't got a sweet tooth, but their donuts were actually, they were pretty incredible. But they just grew too fast. They didn't hold themselves back to the upper bound, and they grew too fast, and they overextended themselves. And as you can imagine, the end of the story is familiar. They ran out of cash because they were growing themselves broke. The investment in the new stores basically used up all their cash, and they didn't have enough working capital to actually fund operations. So they may have had a lower bound, but they didn't adhere to an upper bound.
No, that sounds like a good example. And then, in a hospitality business, there are so many other. Our friend Damien would tell us about how far away to stay from that type of business. There are so many other effects that you need to be prepared. You need to be conservative. You need to uh, be ready to make mistakes, right? Open in the wrong neighborhood because you missed something, right? And you might have
Hmm.
to close again, right? And having a great donuts at some scale does not necessarily mean that you have the skill and the ability to create such a great donut on a 10x, 100x scale. So going to in some kind of planned manner and having the thresholds of okay, until a particular point we can only add one store a month until we figure out how to do that. Then we can maybe double the pace, but
Hmm.
having the trigger points of where you can start it going faster so you can go safer, because inevitably something's going to happen. Jim is talking about it as well, right?
Yeah.
You don't know what's going to happen and when, but something is going to happen for sure. And how prepared you are for that, be it a good thing or bad, that's a whole chapter in Great by Choices in the concept of
Yeah.
luck, right? And the 20-mile march goes to that. Is basically how it makes you resilient to any changes of the environment that might affect your business and your future one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah. I've got the book open here on the 20-mile march chapter, and I'm just going to read some of there's a section here about the elements of a good 20-mile march. So a good 20-mile march uses performance markers that delineate a lower bound of acceptable achievement. So that's the low water mark. If 20 miles is your minimum, 20 miles every single day. A good 20-mile march has self-imposed constraints that create an upper bound. Again, the high water mark that we talked about. A good 20-mile march is tailored to the enterprise. So in my donut example, not opening too many stores and violating the upper bound that maybe they didn't actually set. Um, a good 20-mile march lies largely within your control. Now, that's a good one, isn't it? Because if you can't control the bounds, either upper or lower, then, well, you've got no way of actually affecting the outcome. And this is the one I really like. A good 20-mile march has a Goldilocks time frame, not too short and not too long, but just right. And I think that's the thing that a lot of companies probably struggle to articulate. What is that Goldilocks time frame? And the final one is a good 20-mile march is designed and self-imposed by the enterprise, not imposed externally. So you have to come up with your own boundaries, your own 20-mile march for it to really work for you.
And the same thing applies personally, right? We are looking at it because we're coaches from the business point of view, but a lot of people have their own march. It can be the every day walk with your dog, no matter what. Rain or shine. Obviously, if anybody has any kind of fitness routine,
Yeah.
how important this is. In creative world, being relentless and disciplined about creating the space for yourself to be able to work those muscles, right? Whatever that is, you can find examples everywhere. And once it's followed, you also see the results compounding very, very quickly.
Yeah, yeah. And it doesn't have to be every day. I mean, I know people who, they commit to going to the gym 4 times a week, 5 times a week, but they're not going to beat themselves up if they don't go on a Sunday morning, as long as they hit their 4 or 5 times a week. So it's about consistency. It's setting your constraints, your boundaries, and then being consistent in actually bringing them to life.
And that is the time frame, right? Sometimes it's something needs
Mm-hmm.
to happen every month. Sometimes it's something needs to happen every day. Sometimes it's something needs to happen every hour. Cannot come up with an example, but I'm sure there will be one.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are absolutely essential, but they have their own time frame, and you design your own. That is the key. That is the key here. Not something that you read somewhere, right? Your own goal broken into small pieces that you can predictably fill and plan for, and then create the conditions of successful expedition to go back to the original knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So the 20-mile march, one of Jim Collins' lesser known concepts, but a very powerful concept all the same.